Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtains on the glittery, sunburnt, slow-motion heartbreak of being a child actor in 1980s Hollywood. Not the highlight reel, the real version. The one where a 7-year-old sits on a folding chair on Sunset Boulevard, mascara melting, clutching a headshot, and I promise you, you would not last 24 hours. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. These long, slow histories take weeks to write, and a quiet little tap of that button is what keeps them coming, especially the sleepy ones that nobody else seems to make. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely love reading those in the morning, picturing all of you scattered across time zones, half asleep already. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. Put your phone face down, drop the brightness, settle the volume to where my voice is just a little softer than your own breathing. There will be no jump scares tonight, no sudden volume spikes, no flashing edits. Just a steady voice walking through Hollywood while you drift. Unclench your jaw. Let your tongue fall away from the roof of your mouth. If you fall asleep before the first commercial break of 1985, that is the goal, not a failure. The story keeps going whether you do or not. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it really felt like to be 8 years old and already have a resume? To memorize 14 pages of dialogue between Saturday morning cartoons and dinner while your mother quizzed you from the front seat of a station wagon? Could you cry on cue at 6:42 in the morning under a 10,000-watt tungsten light while a director counted backward from 5 and a sound mixer adjusted your collar mic? Could you survive 3 open calls a week at the Screen Actors Guild building on Sunset, lined up beside 400 other children, all dressed identically in Oshkosh Bagosh overalls, all of you trying to look exactly the same and exactly more special at once? Could you smile through the burn of dental veneers glued onto your baby teeth? Could you sit politely on the studio carpet while your mother and your agent argued in low voices about whether you should drop 2 pounds before the Tiger Beat photo shoot on Saturday? Could you turn down a Happy Meal because your contract weight was monitored every Monday morning? Could you keep working when your set teacher pulled you off stage because California law said you had hit your 3-hour limit, while the crew rolled their eyes and the producer checked his watch? Could you watch your best friend on Silver Spoons get a Trans Am for his 12th birthday and not resent your $34 weekly allowance? Could you forget the name of the producer who made you uncomfortable because everyone at the table whispered that he made careers? Could you read the fine print of a Coogan account before you could read chapter books? And could you finally hand back the only life you had ever known the day you turned 18 and your face stopped being cute? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1983. The smell hits you first, jacaranda blossoms and warm exhaust drifting through an open car window on Highland Avenue. Toto's Africa is playing, tinny and bright, on a radio someone has been thumbing for the last 6 blocks. The vinyl seat of your mother's Pontiac Firebird is sticking to the back of your bare child legs because it is 95 degrees outside and you are 9 years old, gap-toothed, with a trapper keeper of headshots wedged against your ribs. The Capitol Records building glows rust orange through the smog. The seatbelt cuts across your throat. Your mother is driving you to an audition for a guest spot on Different Strokes. This is your life now, for the next 24 hours. Good luck. But before you can audition for Different Strokes, before the seatbelt and the smog sunset, and the trapper-keeper, somebody had to let you in the door. And in 1983 Los Angeles, the door had a very specific address. Actually, several specific addresses, all clustered into about 4 square miles between Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, and the Sunset Strip. If you drew a circle around the gatekeepers of the entire American child acting industry, you could walk it on a Saturday afternoon in good shoes. There was Iris Burton in her unassuming house in Beverly Hills, where the children of the era passed through her living room on their way to becoming household names. There was Cunningham Escott Dipin, more corporate, more paperwork. There was Coralie Junior Agency and Abrams Artists and the children's division at William Morris, the giant of the industry, where a child's signed contract sat in a filing cabinet next to Frank Sinatra's. A handful of offices, a handful of phone numbers. Almost every recognizable child face of the decade ran through one of them. Iris Burton, in particular, was a kind of one-woman institution. A former dancer, sharp-tongued, chain-smoking, with a tiny client list, she guarded the way some people guard recipes. Her roster, at one point or another, included Drew Barrymore, River Phoenix, Joaquin Phoenix, Fred Savage, and a tiny Kirsten Dunst. She did not work out of a glass tower. She worked out of her home. And she screened mothers as harshly as she screened children, because she had been around long enough to know that the kid was only half the problem. This is the part that gets quietly skipped over in the nostalgic version. To get to Iris Burton or any of her peers, your parent had to first survive the slush pile. And the slush pile was vast. Picture a mailroom at the Coralie Junior Agency on a Tuesday morning in 1983. Stacks of envelopes, hundreds of them, sent in by hopeful parents from Bakersfield, from Tulsa, from Toledo, from 1,000 suburbs, where somebody's grandmother had said the magic words. You know, this child should really be in commercials. Inside each envelope, a Polaroid, sometimes a school photo, sometimes a handwritten note in slightly desperate cursive, listing the church plays and the spelling bee trophies. Almost all of those envelopes went directly into a large grey bin under the desk. The bin was emptied every Friday. This was not cruelty. It was triage. Agents at any reputable child agency might take on 3 or 4 new clients a year, total, and were already flooded with referrals from casting directors, acting teachers, and other clients. The slush pile was a courtesy, a very thin courtesy. So how did anyone actually break in? The answer is mostly through being seen in person by the right scout in the right place at the right time. And the right places were genuinely surprising. The Sherman Oaks Galleria, the indoor mall that became the unofficial backdrop of the entire decade, was a known hunting ground. Scouts from agencies and modeling outfits would walk the second floor on Saturday afternoons, looking, just looking, the way some people watch birds. Disneyland was another. Little league fields. Pediatric dentist offices in Encino and Studio City, where the receptionist sometimes also moonlighted as a part-time talent referrer. Bob Mackie styled child pageants, where mothers paid hundreds of dollars to dress a 6-year-old like a tiny Vegas headliner. And, somewhat infamously, the produce aisle at the Gelsons on Sunset, where more than one future sitcom face was first noticed reaching for a box of cereal. If your child got the tap on the shoulder, the well-dressed stranger sliding a business card across the air, your life changed at the speed of a phone call. If they did not, you tried the mail. And the mail, again, almost never worked. Let's talk about the headshot itself, because the headshot was its own little universe. 8 inches by 10 inches, black and white, glossy. The child smiling, but not too much. Eyes bright, but not manic. Hair clean, but a little tousled. And, ideally, one front tooth missing. Genuinely missing. Casting directors of the era were obsessed with what they called the wholesome read, and a missing front tooth somehow did the job in a way no orthodontia ever could. Mothers actually planned shoots around the wobble of their child's incisors. The kind of strategic planning that, in any other industry, would be called market timing. A professional headshot in 1983 or 85 cost between $200 and $400, which is closer to $1,000 in today's money. Acting classes at the better studios, Stella Adler in Hollywood, the Beverly Hills Playhouse, ran $150 to $300 a month. The Screen Actors Guild initiation fee, once the child actually booked a SAG job and had to join, was over $600 in 1985. Add in gas, parking, lost wages from a parent who had quit their job to drive the kid around, and the math gets brutal. Which is why most of the children who actually made it through the door came from a very specific economic stratum. Middle-class valley families, 2-car households where one car was always at an audition. A mother, almost always the mother, who had given up her own career, or never started one, to manage the child's. A father working extra hours to subsidize a dream that may or may not pay off. The truly poor families, mostly, never got close. The wealthy families had no need. It was the in-between people with just enough resources to gamble and just enough hope to keep gambling who filled the audition rooms. There were exceptions, of course, and some of them are legendary. The Phoenix family, fresh out of the Children of God commune, had arrived in Los Angeles only a few years earlier in a rattling station wagon with 5 children and almost no money. Hart Phoenix, the mother, walked her kids through agency doors herself. River, the eldest, was the first to break through, and his earnings began supporting the entire family before he was a teenager. That story is unusual and extraordinary, and we will come back to it. But it was unusual precisely because it was so unusual. Once a parent did get a foot in the door, there were more rules to learn, most of them unwritten. The first was the difference between an agent and a manager. An agent, if they were SAG franchised, was legally limited to 10% commission. They were regulated. They could submit you for jobs, negotiate your contracts, and not much else. A manager, by contrast, was completely unregulated, often took 15 to 25%, and frequently turned out to be the parent themselves, or the parent's friend, or the parent's cousin who had once worked at a record label. Some managers were genuine career builders. Others, quietly, were the leak in the bucket where the money went. The first agency meeting itself was a small, strange ritual. The child would be brought into a carpeted office with framed 8 by 10s of clients on the wall. The agent would ask them to read cold copy from a McDonald's commercial, just a few lines about a Happy Meal or a Filet-O-Fish. Then turn left, turn right, smile, cry if you can on cue, just a little. Recite something. The alphabet backward was a popular request, not because anyone needed an alphabet recited backward in a sitcom, but because it tested how a child held up under a tiny dose of pressure. But the agent was not really watching only the child. They were also watching you, the mother, in the chair by the door. Were you correcting your kid too much, mouthing the lines along with them? Were you arguing the agent's notes? Were you somehow both meek and combative at once? The agent had an entire mental checklist about you, and you did not even know it was running. Too pushy, and you were what the industry called a stage mother, a phrase that could quietly blacklist a child for years. Too passive, and the agent assumed your kid would never make it to a 6 in the morning call time on the other side of Burbank. The sweet spot was almost impossibly narrow. You had to be available, organized, deferential, and invisible, all at once. You had to have a reliable car, a flexible schedule, and no other children whose needs would interfere. Lurking behind all of this, like a ghost in the wallpaper, was the Coogan Law. We will spend a whole chapter on it later tonight, because it deserves one. But for now, you only need to know the bones of it. In 1939, after the original child star Jackie Coogan, the kid from Charlie Chaplin's The Kid, sued his own mother and stepfather for spending what was estimated to be roughly $4 million of his earnings, the state of California finally passed a law to protect minors in entertainment. It was named after him. It was historic. And in the 1980s, when your child was sitting in Iris Burton's living room, that law was still surprisingly weak. It required only 15% of a child's gross earnings on certain studio contracts to be set aside in a trust. 15%. The other 85% went into the household. And there were entire categories of income, commercials, voiceover, modeling that were not covered at all. The Coogan Law would not be meaningfully strengthened until 1999, by which point an entire generation of children had already grown up and learned the hard way what their 15% had actually amounted to. But none of that was the part anyone talked about in the agency office. In the agency office, the agent leaned back in their leather chair, looked at your kid for a long moment, and finally said, "All right, let's try it for 90 days. We'll see what happens." You signed the representation papers on a coffee table. Your child sat on a stool, gap-toothed, swinging their feet. The agent's assistant handed you a small slip of paper with a casting director's address in Hollywood, a callback time tomorrow morning, and a single instruction written in slightly smudged blue ballpoint that you would read 50 more times in the years to come. Wear something neutral. No logos. You walked out into the afternoon sun on Wilshire, holding your child's hand a little tighter than usual, and a small, electric, terrifying thought passed through your mind. This might actually happen. We might actually be in. What you did not know, what nobody in the parking lot ever knew, was that getting in was the easy part. Getting in was the door. The hallway, the long fluorescent hallway lined with 400 other children in Oshkosh B'gosh overalls, all of them holding the same kind of slip of paper you were now holding, was waiting on the other side. And the hallway was where the real story began. So let us walk into that hallway together, slowly, the way you would walk into a memory you almost forgot you had. The hallways of 1980s. Hollywood casting were not glamorous. They were never glamorous. They were industrial carpet, the color of weak coffee, and fluorescent tubes humming overhead, and a long row of folding chairs along one wall, and another row along the other wall, and on every chair a child, and beside every child a mother, and on the floor between them a caboodle's makeup case, or a small canvas tote bag holding sides, snacks, juice boxes, and a backup outfit in case wardrobe asked. Geographically, you could draw a small ragged circle on a Thomas Guide map of 1980s Los Angeles, and capture almost every casting office that mattered. The producers' building at Paramount, with its little Spanish stucco bungalows and its iconic Bronson Avenue gate. The bungalow row at Universal Studios, where the casting offices were tucked between writers' offices and looked from the outside like a pleasant motel. The Warner Brothers lot in Burbank. The Disney studio just down the street with its 7 dwarves holding up the Legends building. And then the cluster of independent casting offices around Sunset and La Brea, in low-slung 2-story buildings with mirrored windows and a Spanish tile roof, and a sign in the lobby directory that said simply, Suite 204 Casting. You walked into one of those buildings with your mother on a Tuesday morning in March, because March was pilot season, and pilot season was the part of the year when every working child in Los Angeles tried to shove their face onto a network's full schedule. The cattle call, that was the term. A casting director would put out a breakdown on the breakdown service, that mysterious daily fax of every project in town, asking for, say, a cute girl, 8 to 10, Midwest wholesome, freckles a plus, must read well, or a streetwise boy, 11, ethnic ambiguous, comfortable with mild stunt work. Within a few hours, every agent in town had submitted their clients, and the casting office had picked perhaps 200 children to come in, sometimes 400, sometimes for a big feature, more. You arrived an hour early because everyone always arrived an hour early. The hallway was already full. You signed in on a clipboard. The intern at the desk handed you a single page of sides, photocopied so many times that the letters had started to bloom into one another, and told you they would call your name in a few minutes. Few minutes was a Hollywood phrase. It meant somewhere between 40 minutes and 7 hours. So you sat. You sat for 3 hours, sometimes for 5, sometimes for the entire span of a school day. Children ran their lines in whispers, mouths moving, eyes closed. Mothers compared resumes the way other mothers compared report cards. One mother had Pepsi and Tide detergent. Another had a guest spot on Highway to Heaven. A third had nothing yet, but her son had just gotten new headshots. There was always a Snickers bar making the rounds among siblings. There was always one child who fell asleep on her mother's shoulder. There was always one little boy practicing the same line over and over, just a little louder each time, until his mother shushed him. The smell of the hallway was a smell you would remember the rest of your life. Carpet glue and the slightly chemical sweetness of Aquanet, and warm Xerox toner from a copier somewhere down the hall, and the faint, unmistakable note of a tuna sandwich somebody had unwisely brought from home. When your name was finally called, you stood up, smoothed your shirt, walked through a door, and found yourself in a small room. The room was almost always the same room, no matter which building you were in. Fluorescent overhead lights, a folding table at the back, 3 adults seated behind it, sometimes 4. A casting director in the middle, an associate to one side, often a producer or a writer to the other. A video camera on a tripod, angled at a small piece of blue tape on the floor. A bored intern operating the camera, headphones around their neck, drinking a Diet Coke. You stepped onto the tape. You looked into the lens. You said your slate, name, age, agency. You said it the way your agent had taught you, clear, bright, eyes lifted, no swallow at the end. The casting director smiled, glanced down at your headshot, and said, "All right, honey, whenever you're ready." The copy itself could have been anything. In a single week, A working child might read for a Hostess Twinkies commercial, a McDonald's ad about a new Chicken McNugget configuration, a fruit roll-up spot involving a tongue that turned different colors, a Mattel toy commercial for something called Lady Lovely Locks, a Crest toothpaste appeal, and a deeply earnest after-school special public service announcement explaining in approximately 27 seconds why drugs were bad. The era's commercial archive was its own strange museum. Mary Lou Retton, fresh off her 1984 Olympic gold medal, beaming through Wheaties boxes and inviting an entire generation of children to audition for the same kind of cereal box wholesomeness. The Kool-Aid Man kids, perpetually surprised in suburban backyards as a giant pitcher exploded through their fence. The Welch's grape juice family sitting around a wooden kitchen table, the youngest girl with grape juice on her upper lip, telling the camera in a tiny voice that this was her favorite. Children booked careers on lines that short. A single believable upper lip mustache could pay for a year of private school. Then there were the scripted sides, the Holy Grail, Family Ties, Growing Pains, Different Strokes, Webster, Punky Brewster, Silver Spoons, Mr. Belvedere, Charles in Charge, Who's the Boss? The Cosby Show, after 1984, was The White Whale. Every guest spot on every one of those shows ran through a casting office somewhere in this same 5-mile radius, and every one of those guest spots represented, for a child actor, somewhere between $2,000 and $7,000 in income, a screen credit, residuals, and the small, almost narcotic feeling of watching yourself. Weeks later, on a Thursday night, while your mother cried on the couch. The casting director shaping most of the great child movie roles of the decade was a man named Mike Fenton. He cast E.T., the extraterrestrial. He cast The Goonies. He cast Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. He was famously, genuinely kind to children, which was not a universal trait among casting directors. He spoke gently. He gave notes the child could actually use. He would, occasionally, get down on the floor in his slacks and play a scene out with a 6-year-old who was too nervous to read. He was also, when needed, ruthless. Of the 1,500 children who auditioned for The Goonies, only 7 would get cast. Mike Fenton was the man who decided which 7. The audition stories from this era are the kind of stories that get told and retold until they harden into legend. And the strange thing is that the legends are mostly true. Henry Thomas, age 9, sitting in a small office in 1981, asked by Steven Spielberg to imagine a moment that made him sad. He thought quietly about his dog who had recently died. Tears welled. He delivered the scene. Spielberg watched, leaned over to his producer and said, softly, "Okay, kid, you got the job." The video of that audition still exists. You can watch a child book the role of a lifetime in real time in 2 minutes and 38 seconds. Drew Barrymore, age 6, wandered into Spielberg's office for the same film, was asked if she had any hobbies, and proceeded to spin an elaborate 20-minute fully committed lie about being the drummer in a punk rock band called the Purple People Eaters. Spielberg, charmed and a little worried, did not give her the role of Elliot's sister, exactly because of that lie. He gave her the role of Gertie, which somehow worked out for both of them. Sean Astin, 11 years old, walking into the audition for Mikey in The Goonies, made eye contact with the room and held it. That was it. That was the moment. He later said he did not really know what he had done differently. The casting team did. They had been watching 1,500 children look at their feet. Corey Feldman, by 1985, had already done Gremlins, was about to do The Goonies, was about to do Stand By Me, and was about to do The Lost Boys. He was the most working child in town. He read for everything. He booked, by his own count later, only a tiny fraction of what he auditioned for, even at the height of his career. That was the math of it. Even the children who made it lost most days. If the audition went well, you got the callback. The callback was a tighter room, a smaller group, often 8 to 12 children narrowed from the original 200. Sometimes the producer was there in person now, watching with their arms crossed. Sometimes there was a chemistry read, where you were paired with another child your age and asked to play a scene as if you were already siblings, already friends, already in love at 12 in the gentle, scripted way of an after-school special. The other child was your competition, but for those 4 minutes you held their hand and pretended they were the most important person in the world to you, and then you both walked back out into the hallway and never spoke again. Then came the feedback. The feedback was where the era earned its reputation. Casting notes were given out loud in the hallway, sometimes within the child's earshot, and they were specific in a way that modern human resources departments would have a stroke about. Too tall, too pretty, too plain, voice too nasal, looks too Jewish, does not look Jewish enough, reads young, reads old, eyes too close together, smile crooked, hair not blonde enough, even though the headshot had said blonde. The casting director was not trying to be cruel. The casting director was trying to find a face for a role, and the face was either right or it was not, and there was no graceful way to say so to 400 faces in a single afternoon. Pilot season meant that this whole choreography happened in some form 4 or 5 times a day across the city. A working child might have a 6 in the morning audition in Burbank, an 11 in the morning audition in Culver City, a 1:30 audition back in Hollywood, and a 4 o'clock audition out in Studio City. The mother drove a Plymouth Voyager, or a Chrysler LeBaron, or a wood-panelled station wagon, ate a Wendy's salad with one hand on the steering wheel, kept the next set of sides on the passenger seat, and prayed the 405 freeway would not seize up before the next call time. Some of those mothers logged 90 miles a day inside the city limits, just to deliver a child to 4 rooms and then back to a 5th grade math worksheet by dinner. And then, after all that, you went home, and you waited. This was before cell phones, before email, before the internet. The phone in your house, attached by a coiled cord to the kitchen wall, was the only line of contact between your family and your future. Your agent would call between 5 and 7 on weekday evenings if there was good news. The agent's assistant might call on a Saturday afternoon if there was a callback for Monday. Most Saturday afternoons, the entire family stayed inside, just in case. The mother did laundry within earshot of the receiver. The father read the paper at the kitchen table. The child played with dolls or Legos on the carpet, listening, listening, listening. The phone almost never rang. That, more than any of the rooms, more than any of the lights, more than any of the slates, was the actual texture of the audition circuit, the fluorescent hum of waiting. The Saturday afternoon silence, the slow, patient understanding, settling over a child somewhere around their 10th birthday, that almost everything they tried for, they were not going to get. And yet, every Monday morning, you got back into the car, and every Tuesday you read for another room. Because somewhere out there, in one of those bungalows on one of those lots, A casting director was going to look up from their notes one day and say the words that changed everything. We're going to go ahead and offer her the part. And on the day they finally did, the real work began. The day they finally did, your alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning. Not your mother's alarm, yours. A small plastic Panasonic clock radio on your nightstand, set the night before, programmed to wake you with the gentle middle of a Lionel Richie ballad on KIIS-FM. The room was still dark. The house was still cold. The kitchen light came on down the hall, and you could hear your mother already pouring coffee, already running through the day's call sheet, already pinning the studio drive to the corkboard near the phone. You sat up. You put your feet on the carpet. And somewhere in the back of your half-awake 9-year-old brain, you understood that today, finally, the audition circuit was over. Today, you were not going to a casting office. Today, you were going to work. The drive to the studio at 5 in the morning was the only quiet hour of the day. The 101 freeway through Hollywood was empty. The traffic lights were blinking yellow. The radio played softly. Your mother drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand around her coffee, and you watched the city move past the window in shapes you would not see again until 12 hours later, in the dark on the way home. You arrived at the studio gate at 6. Maybe CBS Television City on Fairfax and Beverly. Maybe NBC in Burbank. Maybe one of the soundstages at Sunset Gower or Paramount or Warner. The security guard checked the call sheet, scanned the list for your name, found it among the day players or the regulars, waved the car through and pointed you toward your parking spot. You drove past prop carts being rolled across the lot, past idle grips drinking coffee out of paper cups, past a craft services truck unloading muffins onto silver trays. The sun was not up yet. The studio was already alive. You did not get a motorhome. Child stars rarely did. The big silver motorhomes with the pop-out slides and the leather banquettes were for the leads, the adults, the names above the title. You got a small dressing room trailer, sometimes called a honey wagon, sometimes shared with another minor working that day. A folding bed, a small mirror with bare bulbs around it, a heater that smelled like burning lint. A bathroom you tried not to use because the door did not lock properly and the floor sloped strangely toward the drain. You hung your wardrobe bag on the hook. You set down your school books. You put your headshot and your resume on the small folding table in case anyone needed an extra. And then a production assistant with a clipboard knocked on the door and said, in the bright, unnatural voice of someone who had been awake longer than you had, that hair and makeup was ready for you. Hair and makeup in the 1980s was not a soft business. The makeup artist popped open a heavy plastic case lined with sticks of Max Factor pancake foundation, the kind that smelled faintly like crayons and warm wax, and went to work on a child face that did not really need any of it. A base layer, a lighter highlight under the eyes, a flush of blush across the cheeks, a gloss on the lips. If you were a little girl on a guest spot for Hotel or The Love Boat, you got a pale blue eyeshadow that the camera would read as glamorous and that real life would read as a bruise. If you were a teenage girl on a sitcom, you got bouffant curls set in hot rollers, a process that took 40 minutes and felt like a small and steady fire pressed against your scalp. The hairspray was Aqua Net. There was always Aqua Net. There were entire soundstages in 1985 that smelled permanently of a cloud of Aqua Net so thick you could not see across the room. Bobby pins were anchored into your scalp with the casual force of someone who had done this thousands of times. You did not flinch. Flinching, you had learned, made the next one worse. Wardrobe was next. The costumer flipped through a rack of pastel sweaters, leg warmers, members-only jackets, Reebok high tops, scrunchies, layered tank tops, and acid-washed jeans. She held continuity Polaroids in her left hand, comparing today's pose against last Tuesday's pose against yesterday's pose, making sure that the stripe on your sock was the same stripe, that the pin on your collar was at the same angle, that nothing about you had subtly drifted between the close-up and the wide shot. A continuity error in a sitcom episode would haunt that costumer for the rest of her career. So she got the stripe right. Breakfast was at craft services. A long folding table, a checkered tablecloth, a hot tray of powdered eggs that had been hot since 5 in the morning, a basket of cheese, Danish and chocolate Danish, and apple Danish, a plastic pitcher of orange juice that had clearly been watered down, and a coffee urn the adults treated as a religious object. You went for the Danish. Your mother shook her head. The dietitian, who you would see Friday for your weigh-in, would be so disappointed in you. You took the Danish anyway. You ate it standing up in the corner behind a stack of folding chairs where no one could see. At 7:30, the table read, "Began." A U-shaped folding table in the middle of a rehearsal room, set with name cards, sweating water bottles, a pile of fresh sides still warm from the Xerox machine. The smell of Xerox toner was the smell of a working sitcom in 1985. Damp, chemical, a little burnt. The producers sat at the head of the U. The director sat to the left. The cast sat in order of billing. And you sat at the far end, the small folding chair you barely filled, the script propped open in front of you, your highlighter ready. You read your lines clear and bright. You did not push for a laugh. You waited for the rhythm of the older actors and dropped your line in like the foot of a stair, the way your acting coach in Studio City had taught you. The room laughed in the right places. The producer, a man with a beard and aviator glasses, nodded once. Your mother, watching from the back of the room with the other parents in folding chairs, exhaled. After the read, blocking on stage. The director walked you through your marks, small pieces of colored tape stuck to the floor in arcs and squares. Your color was yellow. You hit your mark on the yellow tape and held still. You crossed to the next yellow tape on the line, here, the one about your homework. You delivered the line. You hit the third yellow mark on the laugh. The director said beautifully, "Kid, that's it." And then, at 9 in the morning sharp, the studio teacher arrived. This is where the day ran into the law. California, in 1985, required a credentialed studio teacher on set for any working minor of school age. The rules were elaborate and detailed and slightly different at every age, but the basic structure went like this. A working child between 9 and 15 could only perform on camera for 3 hours of a workday. They had to receive 3 hours of formal schooling. They had to receive at least 1 hour of recreation or rest. The rest of their time on set was strictly limited, and the studio teacher signed a daily time card to certify that all of it had happened correctly. The teacher pulled you off the stage every 20 to 40 minutes. She had a folder of homework your homeschool had mailed her. She had a small folding desk set up in the back corner of the soundstage, near the stage door, where the air conditioning blew most fiercely. She would tap you on the shoulder mid-scene rehearsal, say sweetly that it was time, and march you across the stage past grumbling grips and eye-rolling assistant directors and into the corner where, for the next 20 minutes, you would learn long division. The producers despised the studio teacher. They despised her in a quiet, polite, professional way. They referred to her as the school mom. They calculated every morning how much money she was costing them in delays. There were stories, never confirmed but always whispered, about producers at the bigger production companies, including some at the Aaron Spelling Shop, who hired only the most pliant studio teachers and tried gently, persistently to nudge the rules. But the teacher you had today was not pliant. The teacher you had today was named something like Adria, and she had taught children on this lot for 20 years. And she had once shut down an entire shoot day for E.T., the extraterrestrial, because Steven Spielberg had run 2 minutes long. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She just stood next to the camera with her watch out, and the world stopped. Lunch was in the commissary, a vast cafeteria building with vinyl booths and a salad bar and a hot food line, and a cashier who knew everyone. You sat sometimes at the cast table with the adults who teased you gently and asked about your math homework. You sat sometimes alone at a small two-top in the back with your mother eating a chicken Caesar without croutons, while the dietitian's most recent note rang in your head. In the afternoon, rehearsal again. Then, if it was a tape day, a pause. The audience began arriving at 5:30. 300 strangers, bussed in from tourist hotels in Anaheim, herded onto the bleachers above the soundstage by ushers in red blazers. The warm-up comedian came out. On many shows of the era, that comedian was a man named Bob Perlow, who could keep an audience laughing through 3 hours of camera resets and costume changes and lighting tweaks without ever repeating a joke. He told the audience to clap when the applause sign lit up. He told them to laugh from the belly, not the throat. He pointed at the cue cards along the camera dolly track. He pointed at the show theme as it began to play. And then, in front of 300 strangers, you delivered your punchline. You hit your mark. You set the line. The audience laughed on cue exactly the way Bob Perlow had taught them to laugh. The applause sign lit up. The director called cut. You exhaled. You did it again from the top because they always wanted a second take just in case. Film days were different. Film days were longer, slower, and almost unbearably boring. On a film set, there were hours of waiting in your trailer between setups, hours of standing on a mark while the crew adjusted a key light, hours of takes 1 through 47 of the same 6-second moment. There was a folding chair with your name stenciled on the back of it in fancy white letters that made you feel, briefly, important. There was a stand-in, sometimes another child of similar size, who absorbed all the lighting tests so that your face did not have to bake under the lamps. Drew Barrymore, on the E.T. set at age 6, genuinely believed E.T. was alive. Spielberg had told the puppeteers quietly to keep the creature animate during her downtime, to move his head when she walked into the room, to blink at her, to reach for her hand. She talked to him between takes. She brought him a flower one afternoon. She did not learn until much later that he was made of foam and cable, and 7 men in black jumpsuits operating him from beneath the floor. River Phoenix, on the set of Stand By Me in Brownsville, Oregon, in the summer of 1985, age 14, sat across a small campfire from another boy his age and delivered the most extraordinary on-camera moment by a child actor that the director, Rob Reiner, said he had ever witnessed in his life. Rob Reiner was a man who had been around children on sets since he was a child himself. When he said that, he meant it. Gary Coleman on Different Strokes by 1982 was making $70,000 an episode. He was also, quietly in chronic pain, his kidneys failing, his growth stopped at 4'8" by the same congenital disease, hospitalized between shoot blocks, returning to set on doctor's orders against doctor's orders. He hit his marks. He delivered his lines. He waited for years and years for someone to tell him where all that money had gone. They did not. Wrap was at 7:30 in the evening. The studio teacher signed the time card. Your mother packed up the script bag. The hot rollers came out. The pancake came off. You changed back into your civilian clothes, the Oshkosh sweatshirt and the jeans, and you walked out across the empty backlot in the dark, past the grips loading a dolly into a truck, past the security guard waving you through the gate. The McDonald's drive-through on Sunset glowed on the way home, but your mother did not stop, because the dietitian had a scale, and the scale had a memory. You were asleep in the back seat before the 405 freeway exit. Your mother carried you, still in your costume t-shirt, up the walk to the front door. She would do it all again tomorrow. So, would you? She would carry the script bag in her other hand, with the next day's sides folded neatly inside, and she would set it down on the kitchen counter next to a manila envelope from the state of California, which had arrived in that afternoon's mail, and which she had been quietly dreading. The envelope contained your work permit renewal forms. Every 6 months, every single working child in California had to apply, in person and on paper, to remain a working child. The entertainment work permit, issued by the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement, required 2 signatures that had nothing to do with show business. The first was a doctor's signature, attesting that you were healthy enough to work. The second, and this was the one that quietly terrified every stage parent in Los Angeles County, was a signature from your school principal attesting that your grades were satisfactory. A child who slipped in math class could lose her permit. A child who lost her permit could lose her job. A child who lost her job could lose her family's mortgage. The chain of consequence, drawn out over a single C- on a long division test, ran from a 5th grade classroom in Sherman Oaks all the way to a soundstage at CBS Television City. And every parent driving to a parent-teacher conference in 1985 knew it. Which is part of why the studio teacher mattered so much. The studio teacher, sometimes called the set teacher, was hired by the production at union rates and was, on paper, both your educator and your welfare advocate. She was the only adult on the lot whose job description specifically required her to protect you. The legendary ones, the ones whose names the older child actors still speak softly when they get together for charity panels, were teachers like Adria Later, who taught Henry Thomas through E.T., who taught Drew Barrymore on the same picture, who taught dozens and dozens of children across 2 decades of working sets. Adria Later, by all accounts, did not flinch. She would shut down a $1 million shoot day if a producer pushed too hard. She would shut down Steven Spielberg. She would shut down anybody. But the studio teacher you got was the teacher production hired, and production was not always interested in hiring an Adria Later. Production sometimes preferred a teacher who smiled a lot and signed time cards quickly and did not ask difficult questions. The pliant teacher existed. The pliant teacher was a known quantity. The pliant teacher had a steady stream of work because pliant teachers were rehired and inflexible teachers were not. Your rolling schoolroom on the soundstage was usually a folding table in a corner, sometimes a converted office tucked behind the wardrobe department, sometimes a spare bungalow on the lot that smelled faintly of mothballs and cigarette smoke. There were typically 3 to 6 minors at the table at any given time, ranging from second graders to high school juniors, all working from textbooks their home schools had mailed in advance. The teacher had to log a minimum of 3 hours of instruction per workday in chunks no shorter than 20 minutes, and she had to be able to prove every single one of those minutes on the time card. In theory, she could halt production. In theory, she had the legal authority to walk onto a soundstage, tap a director on the shoulder, and end the day. In practice, the calculus was complicated, and most teachers used that authority sparingly, and some never used it at all. So that was the school side of the cage. The money side was somehow even worse. Let us walk through what a working child actor was actually paid in 1985, slowly, the way an accountant might walk through it on a Sunday afternoon, with a sharpened pencil and a fresh ledger book. Screen Actors Guild scale for a guest role on a half-hour comedy was approximately $350 per day. A weekly contract for a series regular, depending on whether you were a brand new face or an established star, ranged from about $5,000 per week at the bottom end to $50,000 per week and up at the top. The numbers on the surface looked life-changing. They were the numbers your aunts and uncles whispered about at Thanksgiving. They were the numbers that made strangers at church squeeze your mother's arm and say she must be so proud. Now subtract. 10% went to the agent, 15% if you also had a manager, and many children did, went to the manager. 5% went, often, to the entertainment lawyer who handled your contracts. Then there were union dues, taxes withheld at adult marginal rates, business expenses, and your contribution to the Coogan Trust account, if you even had one. By the time the dust settled, the take-home pay on a working child's gross often dropped to under 40%, and that 40% did not go to the child. It went, almost without exception, into a household account managed by your parents. Which brings us gently to the Coogan law itself, and to the boy whose name it carries. Jackie Coogan was a child star of the silent era. The boy who broke American hearts beside Charlie Chaplin in The Kid in 1921. By the time he was a teenager, he had earned, by reasonable estimates, somewhere around $4 million, which in 1920s money was a fortune so large that it stopped looking like money and started looking like a small kingdom. When he turned 21, he asked politely for what was his. He was told, also politely, that there was nothing left. His mother and his stepfather had spent it. He sued them in 1938. He recovered, after legal fees, approximately $126,000. The state of California, in 1939, mortified, passed the original Coogan Act, which required a portion of a working child's earnings to be set aside in a court-supervised trust. It was a beautiful law in theory. In 1985, in practice, the Coogan Act protected almost nothing. The law, as it stood through the 1980s, only required a Coogan trust for contracts that the parents brought to the courts for approval. Studio motion picture contracts and television series contracts often went through that process. Commercials did not. Voiceover work did not. Modeling did not. Magazine work did not. print campaigns did not, and those four categories, taken together, made up the bulk of most working children's incomes. So the Coogan Act, the great shield of the child star, somehow only covered the part of the income that was already most visible, while the steady drip of weekly money from a Mattel commercial or a Crest spot or a Tiger Beat photo shoot flowed straight into the household account, untouched by any trust, untouched by any court. Even within the Coogan Trust itself, parents were permitted to draw what the law called reasonable living expenses. The definition of reasonable was, somehow, never quite pinned down. The reasonable living expense became a beach house in Malibu. The reasonable living expense became a new Cadillac. The reasonable living expense became your father's recording studio in the garage that never quite produced a record. The law would not be meaningfully strengthened until 1999, when California Senate Bill 1162, the modernized Coogan Bill, finally extended trust protections to all forms of child performer income and required at least 15% of gross to be set aside in a true blocked trust account. 1999. 14 years after the night you were carried sleeping from the back seat of your mother's car. 14 years too late for almost everyone we have spoken about so far. The casualties of the loophole are not statistics. They are people. Gary Coleman, by the time Different Strokes ended its run in 1986, had earned an estimated $18 million. By 1999, the same year California finally fixed the law, he was filing for personal bankruptcy. The money was gone. He sued his adoptive parents and his business advisor. He recovered a fraction. He spent the rest of his life working as a security guard in a strip mall in Utah, between guest appearances on talk shows that brought him on mostly to laugh at how small he still was. Todd Bridges, his television brother on the same show, ended up in a parallel struggle with parallel parental dynamics and parallel financial wreckage. Dana Plato, their television sister, ended up in another. The three of them, the famous trio of 1970s and 80s NBC, all ended up in some version of the same room, with some version of the same empty bank account. Macaulay Culkin's case did not break publicly until the early 1990s, but the structure of it was a perfect product of the 1980s system. He was managed by his father, Kit Culkin, a former stage actor whose career had stalled, and who poured every ounce of his ambition into his son. By his mid-teens, Macaulay had earned tens of millions of dollars. By his mid-teens, he had also stopped working, partly because he had aged out, and partly because the family arrangement had become so toxic that he eventually moved to legally separate his earnings from his father's reach. The legal mechanism was complicated. The emotional mechanism was simple. He had to fire his dad. The phrase stage parent, by the way, is doing a great deal of quiet work in this story. The stage parent of 1980s Hollywood was most often a mother who had quit her own job to drive her child to auditions, who lived inside her child's career, whose marriage was sometimes already strained, whose financial future depended entirely on whether the next callback came. The stage parent feared, more than anything, the day the work would stop. So the stage parent did not always advocate for the child to work less. The stage parent sometimes advocated gently, persistently, for the child to work more. The stage parent was, very often, doing her best inside an impossible structure that had quietly made her dependent on her own kid. There were also, more rarely and more terribly, the stage parents who were not just dependent, but cruel. John Phoenix, before his family found stability, was the kind of father whose name his children's biographers still struggle to discuss without flinching. Kit Culkin, in the next decade, would become a tabloid byword for the same archetype. Behind every famous child of the era, there was almost always a parent whose own ambitions had been stitched, somehow, into the fabric of their child's working life. Which is why the puberty cliff, the moment when a child's face stopped being marketable, was not just a career event. It was a financial event. Many of these families had bought houses they could not afford on their child's salary, cars they could not maintain, lifestyles that depended on the next contract being signed. When the contract did not come, the second mortgage did. The family talked in low voices in the kitchen at midnight about what to do. They were not talking to the child. They were talking about the child. The child, by then, had usually been carried in from the back seat and tucked into bed in her costume t-shirt, and would not learn about the second mortgage for another 4 years. One last detail, because it is the kind of detail that says everything. A child making $100,000 in 1985 paid federal and California income tax at adult marginal rates. The so-called kiddie tax, the rule that taxed unearned income of minors at their parents' rate to discourage shelter games, did not even exist until the Tax Reform Act of 1986. A child paid like an adult. A child was taxed like an adult. But a child could not legally sign her own contracts, could not legally hold her own bank account, could not, in any meaningful sense, control a single dollar she had earned. She could only earn it. And then she could be carried, asleep, in her costume t-shirt, up the walk to the front door, while her parents stood in the kitchen, talking quietly about her future, in voices she was not yet awake enough to hear. And while we are inside that kitchen, in those low voices, it is worth turning, gently, to the part of this story that is hardest to tell, and that we will tell anyway, because the night is long, and there is a way to tell it that does not turn it into a tabloid. You should know, before we begin this part, that we are not going to dwell on detail here. We are going to walk through what was documented, said on the record, written in memoirs, testified to in court, and reported by the trade press. And we are going to do it the way you might walk through a quiet, dimly lit museum exhibit, looking at each object, reading each small placard, and moving on. The point of this section is not to shock you. The point is to explain why a system that looked from the outside like a cotton candy factory somehow kept producing the same kinds of broken adults year after year, decade after decade. The point is to tell you what was already true in 1985, even when nobody in the trade papers was willing to print it. Begin with the cultural backdrop, because the children did not grow up in a vacuum. 1980s. Hollywood, the adult one, the one that the children's parents moved through every day, was the cocaine decade. It was the decade of long executive lunches at Le Dôme on Sunset, where deals were made over a bottle of Sancerre and a small folded square of paper passed under the table. It was the decade of after hours at the Roxbury and at On the Rocks, the second-floor club above the Roxy that you could only enter if you knew someone. It was the decade of 2 o'clock in the morning at the Comedy Store, of parties in the Hollywood Hills with the front door propped open and the music spilling down the canyon, of houses where the bowl on the coffee table was full and the bedrooms upstairs had locks. Drug use in adult industry circles was not hidden. It was furniture. It was, somehow, almost decorative. And the children, the working children, the ones whose mothers were trying to make connections, the ones whose fathers were managing them, the ones whose older co-stars were teenagers with their own access, inherited that environment by proximity. They went to rap parties. They went to industry birthday dinners. They sat at tables where the adults were not always paying attention. They watched, with the strange, precocious gaze of working children, what adults did when they thought the children were not looking. Sometimes the adults knew the children were looking and did not particularly care. Drew Barrymore, who you have already met as the 6-year-old in the E.T. audition with the punk band Drummer Story, has been remarkably, almost startlingly open about what happened next. By her own account in her 1990 memoir, Little Girl Lost, she was drinking in industry settings by age 9. She tried cocaine at age 12. She was in rehab at 13. She attempted suicide at 14. She was, by the time she would have been beginning high school in any other life, a survivor of an addiction arc that most adults do not complete. The book is still in print. You can read it yourself. She wrote it when she was 15 years old. Corey Haim and Corey Feldman, the two Coreys, the matching faces on the cover of every teen magazine in the second half of the decade, lived inside a different version of the same story. In 2007 and 2008, the two of them filmed a reality show together for A&E called The Two Coreys. And during the second season, Haim, on camera, addressed Feldman directly about specific events from their childhoods on set, events involving adults in their professional circle. In 2013, after Haim's death, Feldman published a memoir called Choreography, in which he described what he called a network of pedophiles operating in 1980s Hollywood, men who, he said, passed children among themselves under cover of mentorship, of acting coaching, of management, of friendship with parents. The claims, as Feldman has stated them, are his claims, and we present them here as he has stated them. He has named some men publicly. He has refused to name others, citing legal exposure. He has spent the years since the publication of his book trying to push law enforcement to investigate. The investigations so far have largely not happened, for reasons that are themselves a story for another night. River Phoenix, who you also already met, the boy whose campfire scene in Stand By Me made Rob Reiner say what he said, did not survive his 20s. On October 31st, 1993, outside the Viper Room on Sunset Boulevard, a club partly owned at the time by Johnny Depp, River collapsed on the sidewalk and could not be revived. He was 23 years old. The medical examiner reported a combination of substances. The story, told later by his sister and his friends and his bandmates, was a story that began in many ways in the working child years, in the upside-down family economics, in the particular pressure of being the older brother who had to make enough money to take care of everyone. Judith Barcy was a child actress whose voice you have almost certainly heard, even if you do not know her name. She was the voice of Ducky, the small green dinosaur in The Land Before Time, the one who said, "Yep, yep, yep." She was also in Jaws the Revenge in 1987. In 1988, when she was 10 years old, she was murdered by her father in the family home in West Hills, California. People in the industry had known for years that her father was abusive. Teachers had seen bruises. Co-workers had seen behavior. The Screen Actors Guild had received complaints. The system, somehow, never quite reached the moment of intervention. After her death, parts of the industry quietly tightened internal protocols. Most of the tightening would not become real reform until much later. Her name is one we are saying tonight because saying names is one of the small kindnesses history can offer. Dana Plato, the third member of the Different Strokes trio, the on-screen older sister of Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges, struggled publicly through the 1990s with addiction, with arrests, with a custody battle, with the slow unwinding of a career that had stopped at the end of the 80s. In May of 1999, while staying in a recreational vehicle in Moore, Oklahoma, she died of an overdose. She was 34. Her son would later die in 2010 by his own hand. The line of grief stretched somehow into the next generation. Now lift up out of individual names and look at the structure, because the structure is the thing that explains why the names keep coming. A child actor's family income, in many of these households, depended on the child not making waves. A complaint from the child risked the next callback. A complaint from the parent risked the agent's attention. A complaint to the agent risked the manager's relationships. A complaint to the union risked the producer remembering your face the next time a script came around. There were almost no advocates inside the system whose financial interests were aligned with the child's well-being. The agent was a salesperson. The manager was a salesperson. The publicist was a salesperson. The studio teacher, sometimes, was the only adult on set whose job description even theoretically included protecting the child, and the studio teacher was paid by the production. The child was the product. Products do not file complaints. Pull a thread away from the worst of it for a moment, because there were everyday harms too, the smaller ones, the ones that did not make the cover of People magazine, but accumulated in the body of every working girl. The diet pressure. In the 1960s and 70s, working actresses, including very young ones, had been quietly given amphetamines to control weight. By the 80s, that exact pill had moved underground, but it had been replaced by Dexatrim, sold over the counter at every supermarket, and by the grapefruit diet, and by cigarette smoking, which was openly encouraged for some teen actresses as an appetite suppressant. There are first-hand accounts of 14-year-olds being handed their first pack of Marlboro Lights by a wardrobe assistant who said it was easier than fighting with the costume. The cosmetic interventions began earlier than you might expect. Dental veneers were applied to baby teeth so that a smile would read evenly on camera. Eyebrows were plucked on 9-year-olds. Hair was lightened with peroxide and lemon juice, or in some cases, with full salon bleach. Spray tans in the modern sense did not exist yet, so children were tanned with iodine mixed into baby oil and a long afternoon by a Burbank pool, which is, biologically, exactly as bad an idea as it sounds. Hairspray fumes, mostly Aquanet, mostly aerosolized into the 8 square feet of a small dressing room with no ventilation, were inhaled for hours every morning by every child performer in the city. The cumulative dose, over a working childhood, was, somehow, not a topic anyone discussed. Then the sleep deprivation, the 4:30 alarm, the long drives, the late-night tape audiences, the afternoon callbacks scheduled in pilot season after a full school morning, the chronic state of being underslept by 2 or 3 hours every single day for years. Then the strange social damage of returning to ordinary school in the off weeks. A working child who had spent the summer on a movie set, surrounded by adults who treated her seriously, would walk back into a 5th grade classroom in September and be called a snob, a fag, a stuck-up, a show-off. The other children, not unreasonably, did not know what to do with her. The teachers often did not know either. She would, in some cases, eat lunch alone for the rest of the year. It is worth stopping briefly because we should on Brooke Shields, who is not technically a creature of 1980s child stardom, but whose presence shaped the whole climate the 80s children grew up inside. Pretty Baby in 1978 when she was 12. The Blue Lagoon, 1980 when she was 14. The Calvin Klein Jeans Campaign, 1980, the now infamous television spot in which a 15-year-old Brooke Shields said, on camera, that nothing came between her and her Calvins. Her mother, Terry Shields, was the original archetype the trade press warned everyone about, the kind of stage mother whose ambition for her daughter had become indistinguishable from her own life. Brooke Shields herself has, in recent years, spoken with great clarity and very little bitterness about how strange it was to be inside that body, inside that career, at that age. She came out of it intact, more or less, which is itself a small miracle, and which says more about her than about the system she was inside. Mackenzie Phillips, daughter of the Mamas and the Papas songwriter John Phillips, on the sitcom One Day at a Time from 1975 through the 1980s, was openly addicted by the time she was 16. Her father, by her own later account, was the source of much of it. Her career staggered through the 80s and into the 90s around treatment cycles. She has written about it. You can read her book if you want to. Tonight is not the night. Pull all the way back. The point of this section is not to make any one of these stories into a parable. It is to notice, gently, that they do not look like exceptions. They look like the predictable output of a system. Not every child star of the 1980s was harmed. Many of them, somehow against the odds, came out the other side of their childhoods, more or less recognizable to themselves. But the system was structured so that harm, when it happened, was never a malfunction. It was a feature. The economics required the child not to complain. The hierarchy required the parent to need the work. The schedule required the body to be smaller, paler, prettier, sharper, faster than a body that age was naturally going to be. The fame required the child to be available, accessible, parasocially close to strangers in a way that no adult would consent to. The whole apparatus required, in short, that someone pay a price, and the only person standing in the room without a contract or a commission or a percentage was the child. Breathe out. We are almost out of this part. Let your shoulders drop again. The next chapter is gentler, and it is full of the kind of glittering nonsense the surface of 1980s stardom was actually made of. We are going to step into a Saturday morning at a rented Beverly Hills mansion with 3 wardrobe changes hanging from a rolling rack and a stylist in stone-washed jeans. And we are going to look, for a little while, at the part of this life that almost looked like fun. Saturday morning, 8 in the morning. You are 9 or 11 or 14, depending on which year of your career we are inside. And your mother has driven you up Coldwater Canyon to a house you will never see again. A house someone has rented for the day for around $2,000. A house that belongs to a divorced entertainment lawyer who is in Aspen for the weekend. The driveway is full of cars. There is a Ford Econoline van with the magazine's logo on the side, a stylist's Volvo wagon with the back hatch open and full of garment bags, and a photographer's BMW that you are quietly told not to lean against. Inside the house, the dining room table has been pushed to one wall, and replaced by a long folding table covered in a paper cloth on which sit 3 plastic clamshells of bagels from Western Bagel, a half-empty box of donuts from Winchell's, a pyramid of red Solo cups, and a coffee urn that has been on for too long. The smell is bagel, hairspray, eucalyptus from the homeowner's diffuser, and, somehow, faintly, chlorine from the pool out back. The teen magazine ecosystem you are about to feed on this particular Saturday is one of the most efficient publicity machines the 20th century ever built, and almost nobody outside of it understood how it worked. Tiger Beat had been founded in 1965 by a man named Charles Laufer, who had figured out before anyone else that the most reliable consumer in America was a 13-year-old girl with $2 of allowance and a thumbtack. 16 magazine had been around since the late 50s and was, by the 80s, run by editor Randy Racefield, who was, in the genuinely accurate sense of the word, a kingmaker. Bop was the cheekier little sister. Teen Beat, Super Teen. There were others. They lived next to the candy at the supermarket checkout. They sold for $1.25. They were printed on the kind of cheap pulp paper that smudged ink onto your fingertips. And they had, collectively, the power to take a working actor making $7,000 an episode on a midweek sitcom and turn him, in 8 weeks, into a face that 1.5 million American girls had taped above their beds. The shoot itself moved like a small assembly line. You arrived in your own clothes. A stylist in stone-washed jeans and a slouchy blazer with the sleeves pushed up walked you to a back bedroom that had been converted, for the morning, into wardrobe. There were 3 or 4 looks already pulled and steamed: a teal turtleneck for the soft focus close-ups, a denim jacket with the collar popped for the action shots, a striped rugby shirt for the laughing on the lawn shots, and, for the boys, somewhere on the rack, a pair of swim trunks for what the photographer's assistant referred to, with a small apologetic smile, as the optional pool look. The optional pool look was rarely optional. The shirtless on the beach Kirk Cameron poster you remember, or your older sister remembers, was made on exactly this kind of Saturday in exactly this kind of rented house. The teal turtleneck Corey Haim covers were made on this kind of Saturday. The soft focus, Vaseline on the lens, slightly blurred. Ricky Schroeder portraits with the hair lit from behind were made on this kind of Saturday. They look now like dispatches from a country that does not exist anymore, because, in a meaningful sense, it does not. You sit in a kitchen chair while a hair and makeup person you have never met before runs her fingers through your hair, decides what to do with it, and then, in about 20 minutes, does it. The blush goes on a little heavier than for film because the magazine paper will eat color. The lip gloss is the kind that smells like strawberries. Your eyebrows are inspected and, if you are a girl, very gently shaped, even if you are 11. You are handed a Diet Coke. You sip it through a straw because you cannot mess up the lipstick. The photographer on a typical day is a man in his 30s or 40s who has done this for years, who knows the angle that makes a 14-year-old boy's jaw look more like 16, who knows the angle that makes a 16-year-old girl look more like 13, because the magazine's readership is built on the gap between the actor's age and the reader's. He calls out cues like a dance instructor. Chin down, eyes up. Now laugh, but do not show your teeth too much. Now laugh and show your teeth. Now look like you have a secret. Now look like the secret is about the reader. The shutter clicks. On a typical morning, 2,000 times. 3 rolls of film per setup, 4 setups before lunch, 4 after. While you are changing into the rugby shirt, the magazine's writer, who has flown out from New York for 2 days, sits on a couch in the living room with a yellow legal pad and a small tape recorder, and conducts what is technically called an interview, but is, in practice, a kind of collaborative fiction. Your publicist has briefed her in advance. Your favorite color is blue. Your favorite food is, depending on the season, pizza or spaghetti, but never sushi, because sushi reads in 1985 as too sophisticated for the audience. Your ideal date is a walk on the beach. Your celebrity crush is, very specifically, someone 2 tiers above you in fame, so that the cross-promotion benefits everyone. You learn to memorize these answers in the same brain compartment you used for your sides. Then there is the fan mail. The fan mail in this era, before email, before social media, before any of the technologies that have since collapsed parasocial intensity into a steady drip, came in physical bins. A working teen idol's publicist's office, on a typical Wednesday, received between 2,000 and 5,000 letters a week. They were sorted by an assistant who was paid $8 an hour and who, on a good day, opened maybe 1 in 10 of them. The 8x10 glossy photographs, signed in a perfect approximation of the actor's signature by a machine called an autopen, went out by the cardboard boxful from a small office in Studio City. Some of the letters were sweet. Some of them included drawings. Some of them included locks of hair, which, when you are 19 years old and trying to eat a tuna sandwich at your desk, is, in the genuine sense of the word, a lot. Some of them included cassette tapes on which the sender, usually a girl between 11 and 15, had simply talked into her boombox for 45 minutes about her day, on the assumption that her favorite actor would put the tape into a cassette deck and listen, attentively, all the way through while folding his laundry. He would not. The tape, in most cases, went into a bin. The bin went into a storage unit in Van Nuys. Some of those storage units, somehow, are still there. Then the personal appearances, the autograph signings. A typical booking might be a mall opening in Paramus, New Jersey, on a Saturday in October. The actor flies in Friday night. He stays at a Marriott Courtyard. Saturday morning, he is driven to the mall in a black town car. 4,000 kids are already in line. Some of them have been there since 5 in the morning. The mall security, which had budgeted for a normal Saturday, has not. The signing is supposed to last 2 hours. It lasts 4. The actor signs his name 4,000 times in 4 hours, which works out to 1 signature every 3.5 seconds, which is, mechanically, almost impossible, and which means that by hour 3, the signature is no longer a signature so much as a small abstract gesture that resembles the idea of a signature. Mothers cry, girls faint. One girl, in a documented incident at a mall in Paramus in 1987, climbed onto the table and had to be gently lifted off by a security guard who, 20 years later, would still occasionally tell the story at parties. The talk show circuit was the next ring of the machine. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where a teen actor would sit on the couch next to Ed McMahon, who smelled, charmingly, of bourbon and aqua velva, and answer 4 minutes of questions about his summer. Late Night with David Letterman, after 1982, which was hipper and meaner, and, for a 14-year-old, terrifying. The Merv Griffin Show, the Phil Donahue Show, on which a teen idol might be asked, with absolute earnestness what he thought about nuclear disarmament, and would answer with absolute earnestness that he thought it was probably bad. Kids Incorporated taped at Disney MGM. The Saturday morning preview specials, in which the network's child stars were rolled out in matching jackets to introduce the fall lineup. The press junket was the most efficient ring of all. A Saturday at the Four Seasons or the Beverly Hilton, a hotel ballroom carved into 8 smaller rooms by partition walls, 40 reporters in 40 chairs, the actor rotating through 4-minute interviews for 6 straight hours. By the 3rd hour, the answers were on autopilot. By the 5th, the actor's face was beginning to do that small, frozen thing that happens to a face that has smiled for too long. By the 6th, his publicist would walk him to a green room with a plate of fruit and tell him, gently, that he was almost done. This is the era, by the way, that built Ricky Schroeder on silver spoons. With that absurd indoor train, you remember, the actual functioning model train that ran around the inside of the Ricker Mansion set on stage 25 at Sunset Gower Studios, big enough for him to ride. This is the era that launched Alyssa Milano on Who's the Boss in 1984, who at 12 was already a Tiger Beat fixture. This is the era that made Kirk Cameron on Growing Pains starting in 1985 into the wholesome American boy face of an entire generation before he turned later toward Christianity and the Left Behind films. This is the era in which Michael J. Fox in 1985 somehow had Family Ties and Back to the Future on the same week's contract negotiations, and became, briefly, the most famous person in North America under the age of 25. The strangeness inside all of it was the loneliness, the inability to go to a regular school dance, the inability to walk through the same Sherman Oaks Galleria where you had been discovered 3 years earlier, eating a soft pretzel, the strange disorientation of going into a Vons supermarket with your mother on a Sunday afternoon, in sweats, with your hair under a Dodgers cap, and seeing, on the lunchbox shelf in aisle 7, your own face. Your own face, smiling back at you in the wholesome, wholesale photographic version that the magazine had built. You stood there with a gallon of milk in your hand, and you genuinely could not tell for a second whether the person on the lunchbox was you or someone you used to know. By the end of a press day, you would be back in the hotel room, 11 at night. You would order a grilled cheese from room service because you were finally allowed to. You would sit cross-legged on a bed in a pair of pajamas the wardrobe lady had picked out for you to be photographed in for a sleepover-themed feature in the December issue, and you would turn on MTV, the video for Take On Me, the video for Sweet Dreams, the video for the song from your own movie, which the network was promoting heavily this month. In the next hotel room over, faintly through the wall, you could hear someone watching the rerun of your show. The laugh track came through the drywall first, then the voices, then your voice, your own voice, saying lines you remembered shooting on a Tuesday in March in front of 300 strangers. You took a bite of grilled cheese. The cheese was a little too hot. You put the plate on the nightstand. You watched the rest of the video. You did not particularly feel anything. And then, somewhere between the ages of 12 and 15, the face stopped working. That is the cleanest way to say it, and it is also the cruelest. The face that booked the job, the face that the magazines built, the face that fit into the gap between the actor's age and the reader's age, was a face that had a shelf life, and the shelf life was set by biology, not by talent. The cute boy got pimples. The gap-toothed girl got braces. The America's sweetheart, who at 9 had been a small bright thing in a pinafore, grew 6 inches over a single Burbank summer and came back to pilot season in September with shoulders that did not fit any of the wardrobes the costumer had on the rolling rack. The industry, with its usual gentle precision, had a phrase for this. They called it aging out. Casting directors who had spent 3 years building a Rolodex around your particular face simply turned the page and went looking for the next batch of 8-year-olds. There was no ceremony. There was no exit interview. There was just, on a Tuesday in March, a phone that did not ring. For most working children of the 1980s, the puberty cliff arrived without warning, and it arrived as a financial event before it arrived as anything else. The mortgage on the house in Sherman Oaks had been built around weekly residuals. The lease on the second car had been built around guest spot scale. The mother who had quit her job to drive the Plymouth Voyager between Burbank and Culver City had no resume of her own to return to. And the child, who had spent 6 years being the family's primary breadwinner without ever being allowed to sign a check, sat in the back seat of that same Voyager on the way home from a callback that did not become a job, and watched the freeway exits go past, and understood, in a way that no 11-year-old should have to understand, that something structural had just shifted underneath all of them. A few of them found ways through. Ricky Schroeder, who had been the freckled face of Silver Spoons from 1982 to 1987, took a long professional breath, dropped the Y from his name, and resurfaced more than a decade later as Rick Schroeder on NYPD Blue in 1998, doing the kind of grown-up work that almost no one expected him to be capable of. Kirk Cameron, who had been the wholesome American boy on Growing Pains, made a sharp turn toward evangelical Christianity in his late teens and built a second career inside the Left Behind film series and the Christian media circuit, which was, depending on how you looked at it, either a graceful exit or a different kind of cage. Drew Barrymore, who had snorted cocaine at 12 and been to rehab at 13, spent her teenage wilderness years quietly putting herself back together, came back at 17 in Poison Ivy in 1992, and rebuilt all the way to Boys on the Side in 1995, and a producing career that, by the early 2000s, made her one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. Corey Feldman drifted through low-budget films for most of the 1990s, working steadily but quietly in a way that looked, from the outside, like a slow fade. Macaulay Culkin, whose mid-sized stardom belongs technically to the next decade, but whose machine was built on this one, simply retired at 14 after Richie Rich in 1994 and walked away from the entire apparatus. Most of them, however, did not find a way through. The numbers, when you go and look, are stubborn and unforgiving. Of the hundreds of working child actors of the 1980s, fewer than 10% had any meaningful adult acting career. The structural reason is brutal in its simplicity. A 16-year-old former child star had no resume credits as an adult. Casting directors looking for a 22-year-old saw a kid. Casting directors looking for a 12-year-old saw, with a kind of wincing politeness, a teenager with adult eyes. 2 years of dead time stretched out in front of you, and most people did not have the savings, the family stability, or the emotional reserves to wait it out. 2 years of dead time in Hollywood is a career. The cultural ground was also shifting underneath them. By 1989 and 1990, the entire ecosystem that had built them was changing. The multi-camera family sitcom, with its laugh track and its 300-person live audience and its tidy 30-minute lessons, was beginning its long, slow fade. Fox, the upstart fourth network, had launched 21 Jump Street in 1987 and put a strange thin kid named Johnny Depp into living rooms in a way that did not look like Tiger Beat at all. Saved by the Bell launched in 1989 and rerouted teen sitcom Stardom into a different aesthetic with different rules. And by 1991, when grunge came out of Seattle in flannel and dirty hair, the entire wholesome Reagan-era pastel sweater aesthetic that had defined the 1980s child star suddenly felt, almost overnight, embarrassing. The kids who had been the face of 1985 looked, in 1992, like a yearbook photograph of someone you used to know. For some of them, the long tail of the 1980s was simply long. Dana Plato, who had played Kimberly on Different Strokes, struggled through the 1990s with addiction and arrests and small parts in films almost no one saw, and died of an overdose in May of 1999 at 34. Corey Haim, the teal turtleneck Tiger Beat boy, the star of Lucas and License to Drive, drifted through decades of addiction and died in March of 2010 at 38. Jonathan Brandis, who had been the kid from The Never-Ending Story 2 and then a teen heartthrob on Sequest, died by suicide in November of 2003 at 27. Brad Renfro, slightly later cohort, died in 2008 at 25. And further back, as a kind of patron saint of the cautionary tale, was Anissa Jones, the little girl from the 1960s sitcom Family Affair, who had died of an overdose in 1976 at 18, and whose case had been quietly cited in 1979 industry briefings as the reason something had to be done, and which had, in the way of these things, resulted in almost nothing being done at all. And yet, because this is bedtime history and not a tabloid, the story is not only the lost ones. It also has its survivors and its quiet rebuilders. Jodie Foster, who had begun in the 1970s but worked steadily through the 80s, won the Academy Award for Best Actress for The Accused in 1988 and again for The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, and built a career that was not so much a comeback as a long, unbroken line. Sean Astin, the Mikey of the Goonies, did indie work and small films through the 1990s and waited patiently until Peter Jackson cast him as Samwise Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings 2 decades later, where he gave one of the great supporting performances of the early 2000s. Christina Applegate transitioned from Married with Children into acclaimed adult work, including an Emmy and the kind of late career run on Dead to Me that quietly settled the argument about whether she could really act. Fred Savage, the wide-eyed boy of the Wonder Years, simply stepped behind the camera and became one of the most reliable television directors of his generation. Mayim Bialik, who had been Blossom, walked away from acting in her 20s, earned a doctorate in neuroscience from UCLA in 2007, came back to television on The Big Bang Theory, and ended up hosting Jeopardy! Which is the kind of arc that no one writing her bio in 1990 would have dared to predict. So now, slowly, let us answer the question this whole long night has been quietly orbiting. Why would you not last 24 hours? Picture, for a moment, a single Saturday in 1985. Inside that Saturday, for a working child actor of the era, There was an audition at 9 in the morning at a casting office on Sunset, in a hallway with 60 other children of the same type. There was a callback at 11:30 across town in Burbank on a stage you had never been to before. There was a fitting at 1 in the afternoon at a costume house in North Hollywood, where a stranger pinned a pair of pants around your waist and made small notes about your weight on a clipboard. There was a Tiger Beat photo session at 3 in the afternoon at a rented Beverly Hills mansion with 4 wardrobe changes and a strawberry lip gloss you did not pick. There were 3 meals, all monitored, none of them the meal you wanted. There were 3 hours of school in 20-minute chunks, logged on a daily time card. There was a phone call from your agent, somewhere around 5:30, telling you that the part you had auditioned for on Tuesday had gone to another kid. There was a fight in the kitchen between your mother and your father about a second mortgage, which they conducted in the kind of low voices that adults use when they think a child is not listening. There was a moment, somewhere in there, of real joy, a moment when a director said, "Beautiful kid, that was beautiful," and you carried that sentence in your chest for the rest of the day like a small warm coin. And there was a long, quiet drive home in the dark on the 405 freeway with your head against the cool glass of the window. That was a normal day. You would not last 24 hours. Not because any single hour of that day would break you. You could probably do an hour. Most people could probably do an hour. You could probably even do the audition, the callback, the fitting, the photo session, the missed part, the kitchen fight, the small warm coin, the long drive home, in some heroic, adrenalized version of yourself. You would not last 24 hours, because all of those hours, every single one of them, came at the same 9-year-old, the same 11-year-old, the same 14-year-old, every day, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for years on end, with no exit, with no off switch, with no version of their life that did not include the pinned pants and the cold reading and the missed callback and the second mortgage. That is the part that the lunchbox in aisle 7 of the Vons supermarket cannot tell you. That is the part that the Tiger Beat cover, with its careful pink lighting and its scripted favorite color, was specifically designed not to tell you. That is the part that even the actor, sitting cross-legged on a hotel bed in pajamas the wardrobe lady picked, eating a grilled cheese, watching MTV, hearing his own voice through the drywall, did not always quite know how to feel about, because feeling about it was, on most days, simply not on the schedule. Slowly, now, let your shoulders drop a little further into the pillow. The freeway is quiet, the car is dark, the child in the back seat is asleep. And so, gently, we come to the end of the night. Let the day we walked through tonight settle behind your eyes like something already half remembered. The audition hallway with its industrial carpet, the fluorescent buzz of a casting office on Sunset, the folding table in the corner of a soundstage where 3 hours of school happened in 20-minute chunks. The Coogan trust that nobody could touch, and that, somehow, everyone touched. The Tiger Beat cover with its careful pink lighting, the Viper Room sign on a sidewalk in West Hollywood, the puberty cliff, the face that had stopped working. Each of these scenes, which felt so vivid an hour ago, can dim now like a soundstage at the end of a tape day, when one by one the big lights cool, and the only thing left is the quiet hum of the air handlers. If there is a reason this small history matters, it is this. The system we walked through tonight, with all its cracks and all its loopholes and all its quietly used children, was the laboratory in which nearly every protection we now have was eventually written. The strengthened Coogan Law of 1999. The California Family Code, sections 6,750 through 6,753. The Screen Actors Guild Child Performer Guidelines. The studio teacher requirements that exist today in their stricter form. All of them were written, slowly and stubbornly, in the burnout and the lawsuits and the obituaries of the children whose names we said tonight. And those children were never parables. They were people. Some of them are still living. Drew Barrymore became one of the most beloved talk show hosts of her generation. Soleil Moon Frye runs production companies and raises her own children far from a soundstage. Fred Savage directs. Mayim Bialik teaches. Jodie Foster keeps quietly making the kind of films that win awards she does not particularly want to collect. Some of them did not make it through, and we said their names tonight gently, because saying names is one of the small kindnesses that history can still offer. Thank you for spending the night with this story. If you fell asleep an hour ago, that is exactly what was supposed to happen. And the algorithm will quietly tuck this video back into your feed tomorrow night, like a bookmark in a book you are still slowly reading. If you find that this voice is the kind of voice that makes the dark less sharp at 2 in the morning, you might drift on another night into a sleep history of the Hollywood backlot, or the 1970s television variety shows, or the golden age of radio dramas. The subscribe button is there if you ever need to find your way back to this channel at an hour when sleep is being difficult. Notice now that your breathing has slowed. Notice that your body has gotten heavier than it was when we began. The room around you is darker. The blanket over you is warmer. Whatever 1985 once was, the year is over now. The casting office is closed. The freeway is quiet. The hotel rooms are empty. You are safe in your own bed, in your own time, in your own life. Good night.